The Princess and the Goblin, Chapter 27. The Goblins in the King's House. When Chpt fell asleep, he began at once to dream. He thought he was ascending the mountainside from the mouth of the mine, whistling and singing, ring, dod, bang, when he came upon a woman and child who were lost. And from that point he went on dreaming all that had happened since he met the princess and Ludi, how he had watched the goblins and been taken by them, how he had been rescued by the princess, everything indeed, until he was wounded and imprisoned by the men-at-arms. And now he thought he was lying wide awake where they had laid him, when suddenly he heard a great thundering sound. "The cobs are coming," he said. "They didn't believe a word I told them. The cobs will be carrying off the princess from under their stupid noses. But they shan't, that they shan't." He jumped up, as he thought, and began to dress, but to his dismay he found that he was still lying in bed. "Now then, I will," he said. "Here goes. I am up now." But yet again he found himself snug in bed. 20 times he tried, and 20 times he failed, for in fact he was not awake, only dreaming that he was. At length, in an agony of despair, fancying he heard the goblins all over the house, he gave a great cry. Then there came, as he thought, a hand upon the lock of the door. It opened, and looking up, he saw a lady with white hair, carrying a silver box in her hand, enter the room. She came to his bed, he thought, stroked his head and face with cool, soft hands, took the dressing from his leg, rubbed it with something that smelled like roses, and then waved her hands over him 3 times. At the last wave of her hands, everything vanished. He felt himself sinking into the profoundest slumber, and remembered nothing more until he awoke in earnest. The setting moon was throwing a feeble light through the casement, and the house was full of uproar. There was soft, heavy, multitudinous stamping, a clashing and clanging of weapons, the voices of men and cries of women mixed with a hideous bellowing which sounded victorious. The cobs were in the house. He sprang from his bed, hurried on some of his clothes, not forgetting his shoes, which were armed with nails. Then spying an old hunting knife or short sword hanging on the wall, he caught it and rushed down the stairs, guided by the sounds of strife, which grew louder and louder. When he reached the ground floor, he found the whole place swarming. All the goblins of the mountain seemed gathered there. He rushed amongst them, shouting, 1, 2, hit and hew, 3, 4, blast and bore. And with every rhyme he came down a great stamp upon a foot, cutting at the same time at their faces, executing indeed a sword dance of the wildest description. Away scattered the goblins in every direction, into closets, upstairs, into chimneys, up on rafters, and down to the cellars. Chpt went on stamping and slashing and singing, but saw nothing of the people of the house until he came to the great hall, in which, the moment he entered it, arose a great goblin shout. The last of the men-at-arms, the captain himself, was on the floor, buried beneath a wallowing crowd of goblins. For while each knight was busy defending himself as well as he could by stabs in the thick bodies of the goblins, for he had soon found their heads all but invulnerable, the queen had attacked his legs and feet with her horrible granite shoe, and he was soon down. But the captain had got his back to the wall and stood out longer. The goblins would have torn them all to pieces, but the king had given orders to carry them away alive, and over each of them, in 12 groups, were standing a knot of goblins, while as many as could find room were sitting upon their prostrate bodies. Chpt burst in dancing and gyrating and stamping and singing like a small incarnate whirlwind. The queen gave a howl of rage and dismay, and before she recovered her presence of mind, Chpt, having begun with the group nearest him, had 11 of the knights on their legs again. "Stamp on their feet," he cried, as each man rose, and in a few minutes the hall was nearly empty, the goblins running from it as fast as they could, howling and shrieking and limping, and cowering every now and then as they ran to cuddle their wounded feet in their hard hands, or to protect them from the frightful stamp of the armed men. And now Chpt approached the group which, trusting in the queen and her shoe, kept their guard over the prostrate captain. The king sat on the captain's head, but the queen stood in front like an infuriated cat, with her perpendicular eyes gleaming green, and her hair standing half up from her horrid head. Her heart was quaking, however, and she kept moving about her skin-shod foot with nervous apprehension. When Chpt was within a few paces, she rushed at him, made one tremendous stamp at his opposing foot, which happily he withdrew in time, and caught him round the waist to dash him onto the marble floor. But just as she caught him, he came down with all the weight of his iron-shod shoe upon her skin-shod foot, and with a hideous howl she dropped him, squatted on the floor, and took her foot in both her hands. Meanwhile, the rest rushed on the king and the bodyguard, sent them flying, and lifted the prostrate captain, who was all but pressed to death. It was some moments before he recovered breath and consciousness. "Where is the princess?" cried Chpt again and again. No one knew, and off they all rushed in search of her. Through every room in the house they went, but nowhere was she to be found. Neither was one of the servants to be seen. But Chpt, who had kept to the lower part of the house, which was now quiet enough, began to hear a confused sound as of a distant hubbub, and set out to find where it came from. The noise grew as his sharp ears guided him to the stair, and so to the wine cellar. It was full of goblins, who the butler was supplying with wine as fast as he could draw it. While the queen and her party had encountered the men-at-arms, Harelip with another company had gone off to search the house. They captured every one they met, and when they could find no more, they hurried away to carry them safe to the caverns below. But when the butler, who was amongst them, found that their path lay through the wine cellar, he bethought himself of persuading them to taste the wine, and as he had hoped, they no sooner tasted than they wanted more. The rooted goblins, on their way below, joined them, and when Chpt entered, they were all, with outstretched hands, in which were vessels of every description, from saucepan to silver cup, pressing around the butler, who sat at the top of a huge cask, filling and filling. Chpt cast one glance around the place before commencing his attack, and saw in the farthest corner a terrified group of the domestics unwatched, but cowering without courage to attempt their escape. Amongst them was a terror-stricken face of Ludi, but nowhere could he see the princess. Seized with a horrible conviction that Harelip had already carried her off, he rushed amongst them, unable for wrath to sing any more, but stamping and cutting with greater fury than ever. "Stamp on their feet! Stamp on their feet!" he shouted, and in a moment the goblins were disappearing through the hole in the floor like rats and mice. They could not vanish so fast, however, but that many more goblin feet had to go limping back over the underground ways of the mountain that morning. Presently, however, they were reinforced from above by the king and his party, with the redoubtable queen at their head. Finding Chpt again busy amongst her unfortunate subjects, she rushed at him once more with the rage of despair, and this time gave him a bad bruise on the foot. Then a regular stamping fight got up between them, Chpt with the point of his hunting knife keeping her from clasping her mighty arms about him as he watched his opportunity of getting once more a good stamp at her skin-shod foot. But the queen was more wary as well as more agile than hitherto. The rest, meantime, finding their adversary thus matched for the moment, paused in their headlong hurry and turned to the shivering group of women in the corner. As if determined to emulate his father and have a son-woman of some sort to share his future throne, Harelip rushed at them, caught up Ludi, and sped with her to the hole. She gave a great shriek, and Curdie heard her and saw the plight she was in. Gathering all his strength, he gave the queen a sudden cut across the face with his weapon, came down as she started back with all his weight on the proper foot, and sprang to Ludi's rescue. The prince had 2 defenseless feet, and on both of them Curdie stamped just as he reached the hole. He dropped his burden and rolled shrieking into the earth. Curdie made one stab at him as he disappeared, caught hold of the senseless Ludi, and having dragged her back to the corner, there mounted guard over her, preparing once more to encounter the queen. Her face streaming with blood, and her eyes flashing green lightning through it, she came on with her mouth open and her teeth grinning like a tiger's, followed by the king and her bodyguard of the thickest goblins. But the same moment, in rushed the captain and his men, and ran at them, stamping furiously. Away they scurried, the queen foremost. Of course, the right thing would have been to take the king and queen prisoners and hold them hostages for the princess, but they were so anxious to find her that no one thought of detaining them until it was too late. Having thus rescued the servants, they set about searching the house once more. None of them could give the least information concerning the princess. Ludi was almost silly with terror, and although scarcely able to walk, would not leave Curdie's side for a single moment. Again, he allowed the others to search the rest of the house, where, except a dismayed goblin lurking here and there, they found no one, while he requested Ludi to take him to the princess's room. She was as submissive and obedient as if he had been the king. He found the bedclothes tossed about, and most of them on the floor, while the princess's garments were scattered all over the room, which was in the greatest confusion. It was only too evident that the goblins had been there, and Curdie had no longer any doubt that she had been carried off at the very first of the inroad. With a pang of despair, he saw how wrong they had been in not securing the king and queen and prince, but he determined to find and rescue the princess as she had found and rescued him, or meet the worst fate to which the goblins could doom him. Chapter 28. Curdie's Guide. Just as the consolation of this resolve dawned upon his mind, he was just turning away from the cellar to follow the goblins into their hole. Something touched his hand. It was the slightest touch, and when he looked, he could see nothing. Feeling and peering about in the gray of the dawn, his fingers came upon a tight thread. He looked again, and narrowly, but still could see nothing. It flashed upon him that this must be the princess's thread. Without saying a word, for he knew no one would believe him any more than he had believed the princess, he followed the thread with his finger, contrived to give Ludi the slip, and was soon out of the house and on the mountainside, surprised that, if the thread were indeed her grandmother's messenger, it should have led the princess, as he supposed it must, into the mountain, where she would be certain to meet the goblins rushing back in rage from their defeat. But he hurried on, in the hope of overtaking her first. When he arrived, however, at the place where the path turned off for the mine, he found that the thread did not turn with it, but went straight up the mountain. Could it be that the thread was leading him home to his mother's cottage? Could the princess be there? He bounded up the mountain like one of its own goats, and before the sun was up, the thread had brought him indeed to his mother's door. There it vanished from his fingers, and he could not find it, search as he might. The door was on the latch, and he entered. There sat his mother by the fire, and in her arms lay the princess fast asleep. "Hush, Curdie," said his mother. "Do not wake her. I'm so glad you're come. I thought the cubs must have got you again." But with a heart full of delight, Curdie sat down at a corner of the hearth on a stool opposite his mother's chair, and gazed at the princess, who slept as peacefully as if she had been in her own bed. All at once she opened her eyes and fixed them on him. "Oh, Curdie, you're come," she said quietly. "I thought you would." Curdie rose and stood before her with downcast eyes. "Irene," he said, "I am very sorry I did not believe you." "Oh, never mind, Curdie," answered the princess. "You couldn't, you know. You do believe me now, don't you?" "I can't help it now. I ought to have helped it before." "But why can't you help it now?" "Because, just as I was going into the mountain to look for you, I got hold of your thread, and it brought me here." "Then you've come from my house, have you?" "Yes, I have." "I didn't know you were there." "I've been there 2 or 3 days, I believe." "And I never knew it. Then perhaps you can tell me why my grandmother has brought me here. I can't think. Something woke me up. I didn't know what, but I was frightened, and I felt for the thread, and there it was. I was more frightened still when it brought me out on the mountain, for I thought it was going to take me into it again, and I liked the outside of it best. I suppose you were in trouble again, and I had to get you out, but it brought me here instead. And oh, Curdie, your mother has been so kind to me, just like my own grandmother." Here, Curdie's mother gave the princess a hug, and the princess turned and gave her a sweet smile and held up her mouth to kiss her. "Then you didn't see the cobs?" asked Curdie. "No, I haven't been into the mountain, I told you, Curdie. But the cobs have been into your house, all over it, and into your bedroom making such a row." "What did they want there? It was very rude of them." "They wanted you, to carry you off into the mountain with them for a wife to their Prince Harelip." "Oh, how dreadful!" cried the princess, shuddering. "But you needn't be afraid, you know. Your grandmother takes care of you." "Ah, you do believe in my grandmother then. I'm so glad. She made me think you would some day." All at once, Curdie remembered his dream and was silent, thinking. "But how did you come to be in my house, and me not know it?" asked the princess. Then Curdie had to explain everything, how he had watched for her sake, how he had been wounded and shut up by the soldiers, how he had heard the noises and could not rise, and how the beautiful old lady had come to him, and all that followed. "Poor Curdie, to lie there hurt and ill, and me never know it," exclaimed the princess, stroking his rough hand. "I would not have hesitated to come and nurse you if they had told me." "I didn't see you were lame," said his mother. "Am I, mother? Oh yes, I suppose I ought to be. I declare I've never thought of it since I got up to go down amongst the cobs." "Let me see the wound," said his mother. He pulled down his stocking, when behold, except a great scar, his leg was perfectly sound. Curdie and his mother gazed in each other's eyes, full of wonder, but Irene called out, "I thought so, Curdie. I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was sure my grandmother had been to see you. Don't you smell the roses? It was my grandmother healed your leg and sent you to help me." "No, Princess Irene," said Curdie. "I wasn't good enough to be allowed to help you. I didn't believe you. Your grandmother took care of you without me. She sent you to help my people anyhow. I wish my King Papa would come. I do want so to tell him how good you have been. But," said the mother, "we are forgetting how frightened your people must be. You must take the princess home at once, Curdie, or at least go and tell them where she is." "Yes, Mother, only I'm dreadfully hungry. Do let me have some breakfast first." They ought to have listened to me, and then they wouldn't have been taken by surprise as they were. "That is true, Curdie, but it is not for you to blame them much, you remember?" "Yes, Mother, I do. Only I must really have something to eat." "You shall, my boy, as fast as I can get it," said his mother, rising and setting the princess on her chair. But before his breakfast was ready, Curdie jumped up so suddenly as to startle both his companions. "Mother, Mother," he cried, "I was forgetting. You must take the princess home yourself. I must go and wake my father." Without a word of explanation, he rushed to the place where his father was sleeping. Having thoroughly roused him with what he told him, he darted out of the cottage. End of chapter 28. Please go to the next video for chapter 29.